Welcome again. In this video, we will discuss all what you need to know from the CISA exam perspective in relation to risk management process. If you can remember, when we discussed the security controls, which is the method or the tools that we are using to achieve the security, we said that security controls need to be proportional. Security controls need to be relevant to the criticality of the system that we are trying to protect. As we remember, good security is what can decrease risk of a certain threat to an acceptable level without affecting system usability and functionality. Security controls need to be justified. The investment or the amount of the money you are paying in order to maintain or to obtain a security control need to be justified and need to ensure that this control is decreasing the risk to an acceptable level of risk. Controls can be justified through the risk management process. So let's start and discuss what is the risk. Risk can be defined as the risk is the effect of uncertainty on objective. Risk outcomes can be either positive and negative. Take, for instance, the coronavirus. When coronavirus happened, it indeed have a negative effect on all the world. But in the other hand, it was a very motive or a motive for digital transformation, and many businesses start to consider solutions or options like working from home, like remote working, and so on. So, for a company such as Zoom, for instance, coronavirus was one of the incident or one of the circumstances that boosted the level of Zoom to an unperceived level. So the outcome of the risk such as this risk was positive. That's what we mean when we say that risk outcomes can be positive or negative, and for sure nobody liked the coronavirus, and we hope that this incident and this pandemic does not happen any further and never happens again. We hope so. Risk can be measured in objective or subjective means, depending on the asset that we are trying to do risk assessment for it. For instance, when we discuss the reputation is intangible. So when we try to do an asset valuation for the reputation, we cannot use it or we cannot do it in an objective manner. We can use it we can do the assessment in a subjective manner. So risk can be measured either objectively or subjectively, but this will depend on the type of asset. Risks are tied to an asset. In risk management, we try to assess the risk impact and probability, to decide proper risk response to reduce this risk to an acceptable level. The purpose of the risk management process is to identify the risk, evaluate this risk, and decide what is the adequate response that we will do with this risk. The overall goal of this response and the overall goal of this process is to reduce this risk to an acceptable level. When we try to measure the risk in a subjective mean, we use this equation, which is implying that risk is a product of likelihood and impact, and we will see this in great much of details. Risk can be high with a high impact. This is an example for it. Risk can be low with a low impact. Risk can be low with a low impact, but with a high probability. And risk also can be high in terms of impact and high also in terms of probability. So risk can consist of impact and probability. Here we have the impact. The impact when someone fall in this, let's say whatever it is, the impact will be high. But the probability is low, because if this person just stretched his legs, he will pass, and the probability for falling down will be very low. But in this case, risk is very high because the impact of falling down is very high, and the probability for not making it, if he decided to jump to the other side, is very high. The probability for falling down is very high. So risk is consisted of impact and probability. The risk management process is the overall process of identifying the risk and assessing this risk, doing an analysis, evaluate the risk, select the proper response to this risk, as well as monitoring this risk and reporting this risk. So risk management starts with the process of defining what is the context, what is the scope of assessment. Risk management starts with the risk assessment process. So remember that risk assessment is part of the risk management overall process. In risk assessment, we do a kind of risk identification by bringing the asset and try to understand that what are the risks are related to this asset. Then we do risk analysis. We try to understand what will be the impact or what would be the impact of this, of a certain threat on or a certain risk on this asset, and what is the probability for this risk to happen. For instance, this risk can happen 2 per year, 4 per year, 6 times per year. So this is what we mean by telling or saying that probability. And what will be the impact? What would be the impact if this risk happened? We will lose 1 million, 2 million, and so on. Then we do a grading for the assessed risk and grade this risk in terms of the subjective means or in the term of monetary value. So we grade this risk or categorize or do a kind of priority for this risk based on the severity of it. After doing a risk evaluation and finishing the risk assessment process, we move to the process of risk treatment. Risk treatment can have many other terms like risk response or managing the risk. Not risk management. Risk management is the overall process. Risk management consists of risk assessment and risk treatment just till now. Risk treatment, on the other hand, is the process that we decide what will be the response in order to limit this risk. This response, as I said earlier, could be by building a fence or implementing security cameras. This is a kind of response, and this response aim to reduce the risk. This response is called a mitigation. In risk treatment, we have many options to respond to the risk. One of these options is avoidance. We will discuss it. And we have a transfer option, and we have also a mitigation option. So we can stand for it like ATM. Avoidance, transfer, and mitigation. And we have another or fourth option for risk treatment, which is acceptance. Risk acceptance happens when we find that this risk is within the acceptable level and we don't need any further limitation, or we don't need any further steps to limit this risk. So risk treatment process, as I said, is a process concerned about how to respond to the risk. Risk treatment can be called also in some resources as risk response, and can be also called managing the risk, not risk management. Upon doing the risk response, we are reporting the risk, and also we are identifying how to monitor this risk. It is very important to keep the risk under monitoring because, for instance, if we did a risk assessment and decided that for a certain risk we will use an action of accept, we will accept this risk as it is within our risk appetite. And risk appetite is defined by senior management and or the board of directors, the upper management in the organization. And risk acceptance, it simply means that risk will be in a risk appetite, so we will accept it, we will not implement any controls. But we need to monitor this response and monitor this risk that we previously accepted to ensure the level or the exposure of this risk, the effect of this risk, the impact is still within the acceptable level. There is another option for risk treatment, which is ignore, and it is not a risk treatment at all. It is just that the management ignores the risk and deny its existence, so it is not a valid risk response. So for the valid risk response, we have the avoid option, reduce option, or mitigation. We have the transfer option, and we have the acceptance option. In the risk assessment or risk analysis phase, we do identification for assets and we identify the related risk. Then we do analysis either in subjective or objective way. As we said, subjective is a qualitative. Subjective can be done with intangible asset, and mainly we use subjective method in information technology because information technology is not only hardware but also data and information within or processed by these systems. We can also do a risk assessment or analysis using objective means, and objective means is more relevant in finance. When we do a risk assessment for a certain inventory, we can count this inventory and know how much does it cost and do our risk analysis in a quantitative or objective mean. Objective approach can be not applicable in information technology because not everything can be measured. In subjective risk analysis, which is the process or the method that we are using in information technology, the output or the level of risk will not be categorized as money, but will be categorized as subjective level, such as low, medium, high, and very high. Risk analysis can, when it comes to objective, we have a lot of terms that we can use, such as single loss expectancy, annual rate of occurrence, and annual loss expectancy. To make it simple, we need to understand that if we are doing a risk assessment or risk analysis based on the objective way or a quantitative way. In quantitative way, we need to understand how much impact or how much loss we will suffer if the incident happens. This is what SLE is answering us about. So the single loss expectancy is simply how much would we lose if we encountered this risk. Annual rate of occurrence mean how much times this risk will happen across the year. So if we claim that this risk can cost us $100 and this risk can happen 5 times a year, so in this case the annual loss expectancy will be the multiply or the product of SLE and ARO. So it will be 500 in 5 times $100 in 5 times, and in this case ALE will be $500. So this is the let's say the equation that you need to understand. There is another way to or in the questions in the exam, you may find him giving you directly the SLE and ARO and asking you about the ALE, or asking you that after having this control or having this equation, the management suggests a control with $1,000. Would you accept this control? Depending on the result you get, in our case we get $500 and the control will be $1,000. So in this case the control exceeds the cost of the asset itself, or exceeds the cost of the risk itself. So in this case we could not accept such an option, and it really depends also because it is all subjective. But however, we need to understand that in order to obtain the SLE value or the cost or the single loss expectancy in financial term measured by multiplying or producing asset value in exposure factor. An exposure factor means a percentage of loss for a system due having a certain threat or a certain risk. Annual rate of occurrence is amount of events divided by the number of years. In order to have the accurate ARO and SLE, you need historical information. So historical information is really needed when we try to do a risk assessment in a quantitative way. So in evaluation way, we evaluate risk to classify this risk and to understand which risk or which risk that we need to let's say we need to priority the response to it. We have here a case. You have our house in rural area. Some valuable items are being lost every year, blah, blah, blah. So here we have every time successful theft happens, we lose around $30,000, and this incident happened 8 times a year. This is a kind of question that you could expect in your exam. And as you can see here, your security advisor came with a plan to hire professional security service firm to manage the security of this warehouse in return of $100,000 per year. Would you accept this solution or not? As we understood, we will multiply this value, which is the SLE, in product, this value is 3,000, 30,000 in 8, which is the annual rate of occurrence. So the result will be 240,000 US dollar, and we could pay for the security firm 100,000 US dollars. So in this case, we could accept this solution. I hope this is good. So in risk treatment, we have many options to respond. We understood one of them, which is the mitigation. And mitigation method, or the reduction method, is that we found that we can reduce the risk by implementing control. So implementing a security control, whether it is a technical or non-technical or administrative, it is a risk mitigation or risk reduction. We have another option, which is acceptance, and we accept the risk if the loss is acceptable and the risk is within the appetite level. So this is the risk acceptance. There is another term for risk acceptance, which is a risk bearing. So whenever you see risk acceptance or risk bearing, don't worry, it is the same term. We have another option for risk is treatment, which is a transfer. And transfer is simply by paying for insurance or by outsourcing a service. For instance, I did a risk assessment and found that certain service is risky, but it is not a crucial for my business. It is not one of the key functions, but it is a risky, or we have a kind of problem with it. So in order to let's say, in order to reduce the risk, we advise the corporate to outsource this function or outsource this process. By outsourcing this process, we transferred all the risk associated with this process to the outsourcer. But however, this does not limit or deny the liability on the insurer or on the original organization. So risk transfer is really a good topic, and risk transfer is also known as sharing. We can transfer the risk by moving the risk to another party. But remember that transferring the risk to another party, either by outsourcing an activity or by purchasing for insurance, this does not move the liability requirement to the insuring company or the contractor. The liability will be still with the original owner of the data. The fourth option of risk treatment is the avoidance and risk treatment based on avoidance. Simply means that we found that there is a risky process and the risk of this process is very high, and this process is not crucial to continue in business. So in this case, we will decide to terminate this process. For instance, we may find that if we open the internet access for the users, will make us subject to malware, viruses, and many kinds of threats that might come from the internet. We assess this option and see that there is no business need for opening the internet for users. So in this case, we decide to block the internet or remove the internet completely. So this kind of avoidance, we avoid by terminating the process. This is just an example because someone may say that this is a kind of risk mitigation because we removed the internet or disabled the internet using a firewall or something like this. This is a clear point and this is a good point, I know, but this is just an example. And last but not least, we also discussed the risk ignorance. Risk ignorance is not a valid risk response because it is denial of risk existence from first place. So here we have like a reference for when to use any or each one of these response method. We have, if we have the risk with low frequency but high severity, which means in other words high impact or low impact and low probability, we can accept this risk. But if this low impact risk is frequent, happening a lot, so the cost or the damage will be high. So in this case, we can mitigate this risk. If the severity of or the impact is very high, but the frequency is very low, so we can transfer the risk. One of the examples for risk transfer is when we insure against environmental disaster like floods, like earthquakes. We can pay for insurance. This risk is not, or this threat is not very frequent, of course, depending on where you are or depending on the country you are living at. But it is not very frequent in my case, and has a high level of impact. So in this case, we can transfer by paying for insurance. And if I have a high impact risk with a high probability, I need to ask myself that is this asset, or is the process that it is related to this risk is really needed for my job or not. If not needed, then I will decide to avoid the risk. We need also to understand some term. If I have an asset, and this asset I'm just trying to do a risk assessment for the first time, the risk that is coming with this asset, for instance, the internet. If I have an internet, I will have a possibility for having malwares and having threats coming from the internet. Threats and malwares are like of inherent risk or inherent threats coming with the internet asset. So in this case, this will be an inherent because it come with the asset or come with a process from the first place. After applying the control, these threats will be reduced, and the result after applying the control will be called a residual risk. And we will find this at the end of this video. I concluded all this information in a simple table for just your reference. We need to understand that our audit may subject to many types of risk. Audit risk means that the information that we collected during an audit may contain a material error that goes undetected during the audit. Audit risk can be influenced by many types of risk. First one is the inherent risk, and inherent risk is what I discussed just earlier, which means the risk level without taking any action in account to control the risk level. Control risk is also one of the influencers of audit risk, and control risk means that I implemented a risk to reduce the inherent risk, but this control is not working effectively and not preventing or reducing or achieving the control objective that I already has in place. We have also a detection risk, and detection risk means that we have a problem in detecting the risk by IS auditor during the IS audit. The overall audit risk is a combination probability that information or reports may contain material error. Material here means significant, very important error that error did not detect. Any detected weakness should be assessed by the auditor to determine the materiality or the significance of a weakness according to risk-based auditing and internal control. The auditor should be also aware that the small errors, when combined with other errors, may become a material or a significant error. We had a similar example when we said that if we have a low impact risk, but this risk is frequent, which means it happening a lot, this will lead to a high risk. The concept of materiality, of course, and significant will be dependent on the sound judgment of the IS auditor. So this is an important point to take care of. Here we have essential term that we need to understand. Risk, we understood that risk is the possibility of suffering harm or loss. A risk can be calculated in either objective or subjective means. Risk is a product of probability and impact. Impact is influence of an action on something, and probability is the extent to which an event is likely to occur. You are not required to memorize how does it called, but you need just to understand the concept. You need to differentiate between what is the risk, what is the impact, and what is the probability. Inherent risk is the level of risk without taking any controls in place or without implementing any controls. Inherent risk can also be called a gross risk, uncontrolled risk, and the total risk. Residual risk is the remaining risk after implementing a risk response. Residual risk can also be called a net risk and controlled risk. You know the difference between gross and net. So net is what is let's say residual, what is still exists after implementing control. Don't mix the concept between risk management and risk assessment. Risk assessment is part of risk management. Risk management is the overall decision making process of identify threats and vulnerability, assess the impact and probability, concluding the risk evaluation, and deciding the appropriate response and risk monitoring. And it is very important to keep risk under monitoring to ensure that risk is still in the acceptable level, or the response that you just let's say decided is still valid. Risk assessment is a process of analyzing an environment to identify the risk. And that was all for this video. It is tough video, I know it is a long video, but risk management is very important concept to understand. Risk response is very important concept to understand. And I believe if you are keeping up with me up to now, you have a very good level of information in regard to risk management that will support you in your journey in CISA certification. That was all for this video. Thank you very much. And by now, we completed the part or the first part of domain number 1, which is the audit planning. In our next video, we will start with audit execution.